German POWs couldn't believe their eyes when they arrived at American prison camps in 1944. After months of hardship, starvation, and endless marches across Europe, they expected misery. Instead, they were met with something unimaginable: tables stacked with food, chocolate bars, and even ice cream. For soldiers hardened by war, this sudden abundance felt almost surreal, an unexpected glimpse of normal life in the middle of chaos. It was the autumn of 1944. The war in Europe was raging, and Allied forces had successfully pushed deep into German-occupied territories. Thousands of German soldiers, captured during relentless campaigns from Normandy to the Ardennes, were being transported to the United States. These men had faced the harsh realities of the Eastern and Western fronts: bitter cold, inadequate rations, and the constant threat of artillery and enemy fire. Now, crammed into transport ships bound for camps across the Atlantic, they carried with them a mixture of fear, resentment, and the hope of surviving the conflict. Upon arrival, the first thing that struck these POWs wasn't the barbed wire or the guards. It was the smell. The scent of freshly baked bread, roasting meat, and brewed coffee filled the air in ways most of them had not experienced for years. In the grey industrial camps of Europe, food had been a daily struggle. A standard German ration barely provided enough calories for a soldier to survive long marches or battles, let alone to regain lost weight. Many of these men had grown gaunt, their uniforms hanging loosely on their skeletal frames. Now, confronted with tables laden with meats, vegetables, desserts, and even delicacies they thought existed only in propaganda leaflets, shock coursed through them like an electric current. American camp commanders, having anticipated potential unrest or resentment, had designed the POW facilities with both order and humane treatment in mind. There were mess halls where meals were served in generous portions, recreational areas where prisoners could read or play games, and medical facilities ready to treat malnourishment or injury. For the Germans, this level of care was entirely unexpected. They were soldiers trained to endure hardship, yet here they were being treated, not as enemies to punish, but as human beings deserving of sustenance. Accounts from surviving POWs recall the first meals vividly. Bread was soft, butter rich, and the chocolate bars seemed almost fantastical. Coffee, a luxury back home during wartime shortages, was abundant. Some prisoners wrote letters back to friends and family, describing the shock of seeing meals in proper portions, served with hygiene and consistency that contrasted sharply with the chaos of battlefront kitchens. It was almost like stepping into a different world, one where food was plentiful, and survival didn't require stealing, rationing, or scavenging. Beyond just the taste and quantity of the food, the nutrition was carefully calculated. American military dietitians understood the importance of restoring the health of these men, not as a favor, but as a practical necessity. Healthy POWs were easier to manage, less likely to revolt, and capable of labor that supported camp operations. Yet for the soldiers themselves, the effect went far beyond practicality. Many gained weight within weeks, their bodies responding to regular meals for the first time in years. For some, it was an almost disorienting reversal. After months of near starvation and exhaustion, they began to feel vitality returning. In the following parts, we will explore how this unexpected abundance created cultural clashes, bizarre situations, and even humorous anecdotes among the German prisoners. We'll uncover how some POWs adapted to this new life, how they reacted to luxury items like ice cream and chocolate, and the ways in which American generosity reshaped their perceptions of the enemy. But first, it is essential to understand the context of their journey. From battlefields ravaged by conflict to the sprawling, well-supplied camps of the United States, a transition that would leave a lasting mark on every man who experienced it. When the first groups of German POWs were brought to the United States in 1943 and 1944, they arrived in a country that seemed untouched by the devastation of war. For many, the journey itself was overwhelming. Imagine a soldier who had spent months hiding in foxholes or trudging across ruined European villages, suddenly stepping off a train into the heartland of America. He expected hostile glares, anger, or maybe even violence from civilians who had lost loved ones to the war. Instead, he was met with quiet curiosity, sometimes even indifference. To Americans far removed from the battlefront, these were just defeated soldiers, no longer a threat once behind barbed wire. The camps where they were housed were unlike anything most of the Germans could have imagined. Located in states like Texas, Oklahoma, Nebraska, and Georgia, they were often built near small farming towns or rural areas. Each camp resembled a small village, barracks lined up neatly, open fields for exercise, and mess halls that looked more like school cafeterias than prison facilities. The United States followed the Geneva Convention standards to the letter, ensuring that prisoners were given humane treatment, partly out of principle, and partly to encourage reciprocal treatment for captured American soldiers in Europe. The first build-up event, and perhaps the most shocking for many German POWs, was their introduction to the daily meals. A typical American ration included items like meat, potatoes, bread, butter, eggs, milk, and dessert. Compared to the ersatz rations back in Germany, where bread was sometimes stretched with sawdust and coffee was replaced with roasted acorns, this was almost unbelievable. One German soldier later recalled, "It was as though we had been captured by a country that didn't even know there was a war going on." At first, many prisoners were suspicious. They thought the food might be poisoned or a trick meant to break their morale. Some hesitated to eat, nibbling cautiously at meals that seemed too good to be true. But once they realized the portions were consistent, safe, and plentiful, the atmosphere in the camps began to shift. The fear of starvation evaporated, replaced by a strange sense of relief. The second major event was the medical checks. Upon arrival, every POW was examined by U.S. Army doctors. These doctors often found malnutrition, parasites, untreated wounds, or frostbite. For men who had grown used to neglect, the idea of being given medical care by their enemies was disorienting. They were treated with respect and professionalism, sometimes receiving better care than they had back in their own units. One German officer reportedly said, "The Americans fed us like kings and healed us like friends, even as our country crumbled." Work assignments also played a crucial role in shaping their new reality. Under the Geneva Convention, POWs could be required to work but only in non-military labor. So many of these men were sent to farms, sawmills, or construction projects. It was here that they began to experience another surprising truth. American civilians weren't monsters. Farmers would greet them politely, sometimes even share small treats like apples or cigarettes. Some POWs wrote that they felt more respected as workers in America than as soldiers in Hitler's army. Of course, cultural clashes emerged. Germans were disciplined, organized, and used to strict military hierarchy. When they encountered the more relaxed American style of camp management, they were often bewildered. Guards didn't bark orders unnecessarily, and punishments were rare as long as rules were followed. For men who had grown up under Nazi discipline, the contrast was striking. This softer environment, combined with steady meals and humane treatment, gradually eroded their hostility. The first letters home also marked a turning point. Prisoners were allowed to write to their families in Germany, though their mail was censored. In those letters, many described the abundance of food and decent treatment. Some families didn't believe them. How could their sons be better fed in an enemy camp than civilians were in the Reich? Yet, as more letters arrived with similar accounts, rumors began spreading back home. German soldiers captured by the Americans were thriving. Perhaps one of the strangest early events was the prisoners' reaction to American luxuries. Chocolate bars, chewing gum, peanut butter. These were novelties most had never experienced. For some, chewing gum became a source of amusement and confusion. A story circulated of one German soldier who swallowed piece after piece of gum, not realizing it was meant to be chewed and not eaten. Another marveled at the sweetness of Coca-Cola, describing it as a drink from another planet. These early build-up experiences, the food, the medical care, the work, and the unexpected kindness, set the stage for everything that followed. Within just a few weeks, many POWs found themselves gaining weight, regaining strength, and slowly adjusting to this bizarre new reality. For men conditioned to expect brutality, The American camps felt almost like a dream. But this was only the beginning. The longer the Germans stayed, the more they confronted deeper cultural shocks, awkward encounters, and even situations where their loyalty to the Reich was tested. What started as disbelief at full plates of food would soon evolve into a complicated relationship between prisoner and captor, one that revealed as much about America as it did about Germany's defeated soldiers. As weeks turned into months, a strange reality emerged inside the American POW camps. The prisoners weren't just surviving, they were thriving. Reports began filtering back to Washington, and even to Berlin, that German prisoners were actually gaining weight. Some men, who had arrived malnourished and exhausted, put on 20, 30, even 40 pounds during their captivity. This wasn't the image of a defeated, suffering enemy that many Americans had imagined. Instead, these prisoners looked healthier than they had during their time in the Wehrmacht. This development created its first real conflict, not between the prisoners and the guards, but between public perception and policy. In nearby American towns, civilians were struggling with rationing. Families carefully measured out sugar, butter, and meat. Gasoline was scarce. Nylon stockings had disappeared from store shelves. And yet, just down the road, German POWs were seen eating hearty meals, drinking coffee, and working on farms with smiles on their faces. Local newspapers began to pick up on these tensions. Headlines asked why the enemy seemed to be eating better than the average American family. Some citizens even complained directly to camp officials, demanding to know why Hitler's men deserved such treatment. For grieving families who had lost sons in Europe or the Pacific, the sight of well-fed German prisoners was a bitter pill to swallow. Inside the camps, another shocking development was unfolding. The German prisoners themselves couldn't quite believe what was happening. Many had grown up under Nazi propaganda, which painted the Americans as greedy, brutal capitalists who would show no mercy to their enemies. Yet here they were, being treated with fairness, fed generously, and even offered cigarettes as part of their rations. The dissonance was staggering. Some began to question what else the Nazi regime had lied about. But not everyone adjusted so easily. The camps often contained both hardened Nazi loyalists and ordinary conscripts. The loyalists viewed any sign of cooperation with the Americans as betrayal. They tried to enforce discipline, organizing secret cells within the camp, spreading Nazi ideology, and threatening fellow prisoners who appeared too comfortable. In some camps, German officers attempted to recreate strict military order, complete with roll calls and salutes. Tensions rose between the men who simply wanted to eat, rest, and survive, and those who insisted on preserving loyalty to the Führer. This tension led to one of the most shocking conflicts inside the POW system, the silent war among prisoners themselves. There were cases where outspoken anti-Nazi POWs were beaten or even murdered by die-hard loyalists who accused them of treason. American guards, at first unaware of the depth of these divisions, were stunned when violence erupted behind barbed wire. Suddenly, the camp was not just a place of recovery, but a battleground of ideology. Another layer of shock came from the cultural experiences the prisoners encountered while working outside the camps. Under guard, they were sent to farms, factories, and logging camps. There they often worked alongside American civilians. For many Germans, this was their first direct interaction with the enemy. To their surprise, farmers would sometimes invite them to share a meal, hand them cold drinks on a hot day, or chat with them through broken English and German. These small acts of kindness clashed violently with the propaganda that had promised cruelty and hatred. One POW later recalled, "It was the first time I realized the enemy was human. We had been told Americans were monsters, but they treated us better than our own officers." Such revelations planted seeds of doubt that would linger long after the war ended. Meanwhile, American authorities grew increasingly aware of how well-fed the POWs looked. Reports showed that the average German prisoner in U.S. custody consumed around 4,000 calories a day, far more than civilians in war-torn Europe, and even more than some U.S. soldiers deployed overseas. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. German soldiers, captured in battle, were living healthier lives in American camps than their families back home in the Reich. This created a dilemma. Should the U.S. cut back rations to avoid public outrage, or continue providing according to Geneva Convention rules? Ultimately, the military decided to maintain the generous rations. It wasn't just about following the rules, it was also psychological warfare. Healthy prisoners were less likely to rebel, more likely to work efficiently, and perhaps most importantly, more likely to spread stories of humane American treatment when they were eventually released. But the paradox remained. Across Germany, civilians starved on meager rations, sometimes no more than 1,000 calories a day. In contrast, their captured sons and brothers were gaining weight in captivity. Letters home describing the abundance created disbelief, jealousy, and confusion. Some Germans assumed the prisoners were exaggerating. Others quietly admitted that perhaps the enemy wasn't as barbaric as Nazi leaders had claimed. Inside the barbed wire, life was far from perfect. Homesickness gnawed at many. Letters from families described bombings, shortages, and despair. Some POWs broke down in tears when they realized they were safer and better fed thousands of miles from home than their loved ones were in Germany. This guilt created another internal conflict. Was it right to live comfortably while their country suffered? Some accepted it as fate, while others struggled to reconcile survival with loyalty. These shocking developments, the weight gain, the ideological clashes inside the camps, and the resentment from American civilians, turned the POW experience into something far more complex than just imprisonment. What was meant to be a system of containment had become a mirror, reflecting uncomfortable truths about propaganda, humanity, and the strange contradictions of war. By 1944, the German POW system in America had grown into a massive operation. Over 400,000 prisoners scattered across nearly every state. Each camp was a small world unto itself, where the strange contradictions of war played out daily. And nowhere were these contradictions more evident than in the deepening divide among the prisoners. Inside the barbed wire, two factions had emerged: the hardcore Nazi loyalists and the ordinary soldiers who simply wanted to survive. For the diehards, surrender was shameful, and comfort was dangerous. They preached that enjoying American food and kindness was a betrayal of the fatherland. They formed underground networks, known as National Socialist Leadership Groups, which operated like shadow governments inside the camps. These men enforced loyalty through intimidation, threats, and even violence. For the average prisoner, however, life in America was almost surreal. They were eating 3 meals a day, often with more calories than they had ever received back home. They were clothed, sheltered, and sometimes even entertained with access to sports, music, and libraries. They played soccer matches, organized theater performances, and held classes where professors and teachers among the prisoners gave lectures. To them, survival meant adapting, and perhaps even enjoying, a system that treated them better than expected. But the clash between these two worlds came to a head in shocking ways. In several camps, outspoken prisoners who voiced anti-Nazi opinions were attacked, beaten, or even killed by loyalist groups. American guards, stunned by the violence, often underestimated just how far Nazi ideology had penetrated. One infamous case was the murder of Johannes Kunze in 1943, a German POW in Texas who had dared to criticize Hitler. Loyalists dragged him from his bunk, beat him savagely, and left him dead. When U.S. authorities investigated, they discovered an underground network so disciplined and secretive that it resembled a miniature Gestapo operating within American soil. These revelations shocked the American public when news leaked. The idea that Nazi fanatics could commit murder inside an American camp raised questions about how safe these facilities truly were. But it also highlighted a critical turning point, the recognition that not all German prisoners were the same. Some were fervent believers in the Nazi cause, while others were farm boys, students, or draftees who had never wanted to fight in the first place. Meanwhile, outside the fences, tensions between Americans and the POWs continued to grow. Civilians resented what they perceived as luxuries given to the enemy. Families who sacrificed butter and sugar on the home front sometimes spotted German prisoners on local farms, drinking cold milk or eating pies offered by friendly farmers. To the grieving mother who had lost a son in Normandy, this seemed like an outrage. To the farmer who needed help harvesting wheat, the POWs were simply extra hands, and surprisingly hard-working ones at that. The U.S. government found itself walking a delicate line. On one hand, they had to maintain compliance with the Geneva Conventions, ensuring humane treatment for the prisoners. On the other hand, they had to manage American anger and grief, which flared whenever stories of fat, happy Germans circulated in the press. Officials quietly adjusted policies, reducing visible privileges, restricting movements, and increasing oversight, to calm public outrage. Yet the rations stayed generous, a calculated decision that kept prisoners cooperative and reduced the risk of rebellion. And cooperation was indeed vital. By 1944, with so many young American men overseas, the U.S. home front faced a labor shortage. POWs became essential workers. In Texas, they picked cotton. In the Midwest, they harvested corn and wheat. In the South, they logged timber. Their labor kept farms afloat, factories running, and even military supply chains moving. In some areas, they became so critical that local communities grew quietly dependent on them, even if resentment still simmered. For the prisoners, this work created yet another turning point. Day after day, they interacted with ordinary Americans, farmers, factory foremen, housewives who brought them lemonade on hot afternoons. Many POWs were struck by the casual kindness they received. One recalled, "I could not believe it. An American woman handed me food with a smile. I asked myself, how could these people be the monsters we were told to hate?" These moments planted seeds of transformation. Young German soldiers who had once sworn loyalty to Hitler began to see America not as a brutal enemy, but as a land of abundance, fairness, and freedom. And while not all prisoners changed their minds, the exposure to this different reality created cracks in the ideological armor that Nazi leaders had worked so hard to build. Inside the camps, another shift was underway. As the war dragged on and Germany's defeat loomed larger, even some loyalists began to waver. Letters from home told of cities in ruins, families going hungry, and relentless Allied bombings. The contrast was undeniable. They were gaining weight and strength in captivity, while their families starved under the collapsing Reich. The guilt grew heavier with every letter, every rumor, every whisper of surrender. This emotional conflict created strange scenes. In some camps, prisoners secretly celebrated American holidays like Thanksgiving or Christmas, adapting them into their own traditions. Others listened to American music, learned English, or joined educational programs offered by the U.S. military. To many, it felt like a betrayal of the past, but also like a glimpse of a possible future. And so the camps became more than holding pens. They became crossroads of ideology. Every shared meal, every farm shift, every whispered debate inside the barracks chipped away at the old certainties. For the Americans, the shocking discovery was that humane treatment could be more powerful than punishment. For the Germans, the shocking discovery was that the enemy might be more humane than their own leaders had ever been. The stage was set for the final chapters of this story, where the true consequences of America's decision to feed, shelter, and even educate its prisoners would be revealed in ways few could have imagined. By late 1944 and into 1945, the balance inside America's POW camps shifted dramatically. What had once been a battle of wills, between Nazi loyalists clinging to ideology and ordinary soldiers simply trying to survive, was reaching its climax. The outside world was closing in. News of Germany's crumbling front lines filtered into the camps, carried by letters, rumors, and the occasional smuggled newspaper. For many prisoners, the question was no longer whether Germany would lose, but how soon the final collapse would come. Inside the camps, the iron grip of the loyalist factions began to weaken. At first, they had held power through fear. Prisoners who dared criticize Hitler or admit admiration for America risked brutal beatings, or worse. But as Germany's defeats mounted, cracks formed in their authority. Prisoners who once kept their heads down now began to speak up. And guards noticed that the fierce salutes and military roll calls that had once been routine grew less frequent, replaced instead by weary resignation. In some camps, dramatic confrontations broke out. Ordinary prisoners began to resist the loyalists, sometimes physically, other times through small acts of defiance. They ignored orders, laughed at propaganda, or openly voiced doubt about Hitler's promises. The tension exploded in moments of chaos, barracks filled with shouting, fists flying, and guards rushing in to separate men who had once served side by side. One American officer later recalled that it was as though two wars were being fought at once, the Allies against Germany and Germans against themselves within the fences. It was in many ways the final unmasking of the Nazi myth that even among their own, fear and brutality could not hold forever. For the Americans, this internal breakdown presented both risks and opportunities. On one hand, violence inside the camps threatened order. On the other, it revealed something remarkable: humane treatment was working as a weapon more powerful than bullets. The more prisoners ate well, worked alongside Americans, and experienced fair treatment, the less grip Nazi ideology had on them. Every pound gained on an American diet, every farm shift under a smiling foreman, chipped away at Hitler's image as a savior. And then came the turning point. Germany's highest surrender in May 1945. When word reached the camps, the reaction was electric. In some places, loyalists tried to rally one last time, insisting the fight wasn't over, that secret weapons or hidden armies would rise again. But the majority of prisoners knew the truth. The Reich was gone, their homeland in ruins. For many, the surrender brought a flood of relief. No more fighting, no more uncertainty, no more fear of being sent back into battle. The resolution, however, was bittersweet. With the war over, many prisoners longed to return home, but their release was not immediate. The US and Allied nations held hundreds of thousands of Germans for months, even years, to help rebuild and work in labor programs. For some, captivity extended well into 1946 or even 1947. The strange paradox continued even after the guns had fallen. Silent, these men lived in relative comfort, well-fed, safe, and cared for, while their families in Germany starved amid rubble and devastation. It was during this period that some of the most profound realizations occurred. Prisoners received letters describing starvation, bombed-out homes, and desperate shortages. They compared these accounts with their own abundance: meat on the table, warm beds, and even the occasional chocolate bar or bottle of Coca-Cola. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Many began to admit openly what they had whispered for months, that in America they had lived better as captives than as free men in Hitler and Germany. The climax of this strange saga wasn't marked by a great battle or a prison uprising, but by something quieter, almost invisible: a shift in belief. For thousands of men, the Nazi dream of conquest ended not just with Germany's defeat, but with the realization that the enemy had fed them, clothed them, and treated them with dignity. Some POWs later said that their first seeds of doubt in Nazi ideology were planted not on the battlefield, but in the chow halls of American camps, where they ate meals better than their own citizens back home. For the Americans, the resolution carried its own lessons. Treating prisoners humanely had not only upheld the Geneva Convention, it had also undermined the enemy's ideology from within. The weight gain of German POWs wasn't just a curious footnote in history. It symbolized something far greater: the victory of abundance over scarcity, of fairness over fear, of democracy over dictatorship. As the camps gradually emptied and men were shipped back to Germany, many carried with them stories of their time in America. Stories of kindness, of food, of strange contradictions. Some would later become voices for reconciliation, shaping post-war ties between Germany and the United States. Others simply returned home heavier, healthier, and with a nagging question in their minds: Why had the enemy treated them better than their own leaders ever had? This ultimately was the climax and resolution of the German POW experience in America. Not a tale of starvation, cruelty, or endless suffering, but of irony, paradox, and unexpected humanity. A story where prisoners walked out of captivity not broken, but stronger, healthier, and forever changed. When the war finally ended in 1945, the German POW camps across America began preparing for repatriation. Thousands of men who had lived for years in small towns of Texas, Louisiana, Kansas, and Pennsylvania were now preparing to go home. But what awaited them in Germany was shocking. Their homeland had been reduced to rubble by Allied bombing campaigns. Cities like Hamburg, Dresden, and Cologne were unrecognizable, mere skeletons of what they once were. For many POWs, stepping off the boat in Europe was like walking into another world. After years of living in relative safety, with regular meals, libraries, even occasional dances with local communities, they now faced hunger, despair, and the chaos of a defeated nation. Some prisoners would later say they almost didn't recognize their own families. Children were skeletal, women malnourished, and the once proud streets of Germany were filled with rubble. And here lies the twist. These returning POWs, who had been captured as soldiers, now found themselves in better shape than the civilians who had survived in Germany. American rations with their meat, sugar, bread, and occasional coffee had left many German prisoners healthier and, ironically, heavier than before. In some cases, they became symbols of survival, walking proof that food, not just weapons, had been the true power of the Allies. Historians often note that the way America treated its prisoners played a role in shaping the post-war world. Many of those former POWs carried memories of American abundance, fairness, and discipline back home. Some even became advocates for rebuilding Germany under democratic ideals, recalling the respect they had received, even in captivity. But for others, it was an emotional paradox. How could they reconcile being fed so well by the enemy while their own families had starved? Letters written in the late 1940s capture this heartbreak. One ex-POW wrote, "I ate more in those American camps than my wife and children ate for years. That is the weight I carry, not on my body, but in my heart." As time passed, stories of this unusual chapter in history began to emerge, and people realized the strange truth: the enemy's prisoners had lived better than the citizens they left behind. It is one of the most ironic and haunting consequences of the Second World War. And perhaps that is the ultimate lesson. Wars are not just fought with bombs and bullets. They are fought with food, with logistics, with the power to sustain life. And in that realm, America showed its strength in a way that no soldier expected. So the next time you hear about the war, remember this overlooked fact. German soldiers, captured on foreign soil, left America heavier and healthier than when they arrived. A shocking testament to how even in the darkest times, history can still surprise us. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, make sure to hit that subscribe button for more untold World War II stories. Share this video with anyone who loves history, and don't forget to leave a comment about what part of this story shocked you the most. Because here on this channel, we uncover the truths that textbooks leave behind. This has been one of the most ironic chapters of World War II history, the tale of German POWs who gained weight, eating American rations,